Tariffs protect privileged businesses. The subsidy provided to businesses through tariffs abuses customers who are forced to pay higher prices. But it also makes it easier for firms to become and remain large. By insulating them against pressures that would otherwise be exerted by workers and firms in other communities, tariffs and similar barriers enable the businesses that benefit from them to become fat and lazy, and so reduce the need for them to adopt more efficient organizational structures. Highway expenditures subsidize firm size. When the state funds highway construction and maintenance out of general revenues, it subsidizes all highway transit. But even when it uses funds from fuel taxes to support highway projects, it subsidizes businesses that depend on long-distance trucking if it structures taxes in such a way that heavy trucks pay less than their fair share of construction and maintenance costs. Similarly, when it uses eminent domain to acquire land for airports and other items of air traffic infrastructure, it allows them to be made available to businesses that depend on them directly or indirectly at a lower cost than these firms would otherwise have to pay to acquire them. Transportation subsidies make it more economical for large, multi-site businesses to operate. Such firms can ship goods for long distances. If, given the existence of subsidized transportation, it makes economic sense for them to do this rather than producing and distributing locally, then it will seem more reasonable for them to create large-scale bureaucracies to manage their multi-site operations. Ending privilege means reducing hierarchy. State-granted privileges, including those that effectively subsidize inefficient business models, promote hierarchy. Eliminating those privileges could therefore significantly reduce workplace hierarchies. Large organizations are inefficient. They are also unresponsive and more likely than smaller ones to be inhumane. There's no perfect workplace, but workplaces without managers are likely to be far more appealing in some important respects than workplaces with managers. Being treated like a subordinate without the authority to help shape organizational objectives and the way in which you do your own work can be pretty frustrating and humiliating. The most common argument for the view that hierarchies dominated by people with MBAs are somehow preferable to partnerships and cooperatives is that large organizations are complex in ways that require the purportedly expert leadership of trained managers. But the smaller the organization, the less reason there might be for a structure that distinguishes between workers who produce goods and services for others and managers who oversee the workers. Without state subsidies, then, the rationale for rule by NBAs begins to dissolve. Without the direct and indirect subsidies provided to big businesses by the state, it would be significantly more difficult for these firms to be large, and the case for managerial bureaucracy as opposed to participatory management structures, or ones that enable workers to govern themselves in cooperatives, is substantially reduced as business size increases. State action facilitates the persistence of centralized organizational bureaucracies that disempower workers. Not only are hierarchies inefficient, they're unpleasant. Most people don't like to work in organizational settings in which they're treated as impersonal cogs in vast machines, in which they're denied meaningful opportunities to participate in making decisions and to make effective use of their ground-level expertise. People prefer to make their own decisions, and most would rather not deal with the petty indignities and humiliations that make so many workplaces hellish. I suspect, therefore, that most people would opt to work in partnerships or cooperatives or as independent contractors rather than in hierarchical bureaucracies, if they could afford to do so. So why don't more people work for themselves or in partnerships or cooperatives? There are two obvious reasons. the costs associated with starting a business are often high. In addition, working for someone else can mean avoiding some financial risks people who work for themselves have to confront. Without the state, the barriers to starting a new small firm, whether cooperative or independent, would be lower. Licensing requirements wouldn't serve as barriers to entry into particular markets. Zoning rules wouldn't prevent people from working from their own homes. The various kinds of subsidies to organizational size I've already discussed would no longer be available, so it would be harder for large firms to crowd out small ones. Larger existing firms would have to pay the price of bigness rather than passing the costs on to ordinary people through the tax system, so it would be harder for them to crowd out new entrants. At the same time, startup capital would be easier to come by. For instance, absent governmental banking rules, people could create mutual banks and save money on administrative and related costs. So opening a new business would be a less daunting proposition than it is now. And without the state's interference, as I suggest in the next section, the cost of living for ordinary people would be lower, just like the costs of starting a new firm to replace a failed one. So the risks associated with being out of work would be lower too. Without building codes and zoning regulations, housing would be cheaper, and out-of-home work sites could be located closer to people's residences. Without tariffs and, quote, intellectual property, unquote, consumer goods would be less expensive. Without corporatist regulations and subsidies, resources would be spent more efficiently and prices would be lower. Without taxes, people would have more disposable income. In short, without the state, people would find it easier to start businesses. And with lower living costs, it would be easier to save for rainy days and easier to pick up the pieces if things didn't go well. So, assuming the risks associated with starting a business could be less stressful. And it's hard not to think that this would put indirect pressure on hierarchical behemoths to change the way they operated. Without the state's help in propping up their antiquated, authoritarian approaches to production and distribution, it would be tougher for them to retain workers very much aware of alternative possibilities. If workers knew they could create more livable workplaces on their own, they would be able to negotiate for better pay and working conditions. With more options, they would enjoy considerably more bargaining power than they do now. There would be good reason for business giants to stop pushing workers around and start creating more autonomous work environments. Obviously, instead of reducing the time they spent working for others, some people might prefer to let others carry even the reduced risks they would face in the absence of the state and concentrate on boosting their incomes and their stocks of consumer goods. For many people, though, the long-term goal would doubtless still be to leave workplace hierarchies behind, and the more people who did this, the more likely it would be that these hierarchies would become part of a world well lost. Without the state, it would be a lot easier for people to make their work environments humane and inviting. The state makes people poor. Many different factors can create poverty or make it worse. But despite the rhetoric you often hear from its defenders, the state plays a vital role in making and keeping people poor. A history of robbery. The state engages in and sanctions the forcible redistribution of wealth from ordinary people to privileged elites. For instance, at a time when land was the principal source of wealth, the British government imposed rules in accordance with which land previously shared by the residents of particular communities would no longer be accessible to all of them, but would instead be allocated as the personal property of members of local elite groups. Thus, it deprived people of access to vital resources and left many with few options but to go to work in unsafe, oppressive factory settings. And this was no coincidence. Members of the British elite made clear that it was important to them that ordinary people not have the option to be lazy. They needed to be forced into service in the burgeoning industrial economy. The government also imposed rules that limited how much ordinary people could travel in search of work, thus forcing them to accept unattractive options closer to home even if they could have obtained better work farther away. Naturally, this arrangement tended to keep ordinary people poor. Meanwhile, by keeping workers' incomes, and so employers' labor costs, down, it boosted the profits of the members of the elite who employed poor people who were prevented by law from obtaining better work. This is hardly the only period in which government officials stacked the deck against ordinary people in ways that made poverty more likely. Another obvious example, when Britain colonized North America, the British government simply claimed vast tracts of land in virtue of the Crown's supposed authority and dispersed them to the politically well-connected. Land that might have enabled ordinary people, both American Indians and European settlers, to survive and thrive was instead concentrated through the exercise of naked power in the hands of a few. Similarly, government power created vast agricultural estates in Latin America. Land that should have belonged to the peasants who lived and worked on it was treated as the property of politically connected colonists, while the peasants themselves became little better than slaves. Governments around the world gave their blessing to slavery. Large-scale land theft, the violent creation of underclasses of peasants and slaves, and similar injustices are as old as the state itself, and perhaps older. Sanctioned and often effected by the overwhelming force at the state's disposal, these injustices have contributed dramatically to the distribution of wealth in today's world. Wealth and poverty are self-perpetuating, and the state's past deprivation of ordinary people's land and access to resources, and their very lives, has ongoing ramifications. Once dispossessed, people find it harder to get back on their feet and achieve real security and comfort. At the same time, with the privileges conferred on them by the state, members of the elite find it easier to maintain their economic positions and to influence the state actors in ways that will lead to their receiving even more privileges.